Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, may I thank the musicians organised by Eamon Spillane from Cultus, and not the form that we later. It's got some special songs I'm going to do later, halfway through the show. Good afternoon, I'm Peter Gavin, I'm the Chairman of the Cultural Heritage Committee of the Celtic Club, and that's the reason why Val appointed me as the MC. So it is a hAon Celtic Club venue, as you can see the signs here. It's leased out to a manager, so we don't actually operate the place, but we were unable to use the venue. The Celtic Club acknowledges the traditional owners of the land on which we live and work. We pay our respects to the people of the Colin Nation and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past and present. So with that, I'm introducing the first speaker, who is the Secretary of the Celtic Club, Siobhan Lavin. It's an apology for the President, who happens to be overseas. It's unavoidable. Siobhan has been as the Secretary of the Club and has been a committee member in the past as well. And her father was the manager and the treasurer and a large activist and a life member of the club. So Siobhan comes from very solid stock. Welcome, Siobhan.
Thank you, thanks Pete. And welcome everybody, and thank you for being here today. Yes, as Pete said, my name is Siobhan Lavin, I'm Secretary of the Celtic Club, and Pat McGarry sends his apologies from Europe, and we would love to have been here today. On behalf of the Celtic Club, I'd just like to express our gratitude and pleasure at being associated with the launch of the first book written in Irish by Australians, by the Australian authors, yes. And yes, thanks. And that book, of course, now it's just going to test me, Gaeilge Ghriandoite A, hAon. Hopefully that translates to a Sunburnt Gaelic from A to Z, the first volume. So for any of you that are holding the book, I noticed a few of you are buying that book today. If you're holding that book, when you take it home, maybe you leave it out on the kitchen bench or on the coffee table, within reach of your kids and your grandkids, so that they can curiously flick through it and ask questions about their heritage and the Gaelic spoken here in Australia. I am Australian born to an Irish dad, and I'm immensely proud of my Irish Australian heritage. And I feel a strong sense of belonging when I hear the Gaelic spoken in my community, and to have a book that contributes to that sense of belonging, I think really does tighten the bond between those amongst us who identify as Irish Australians. I obviously can't speak Gaelic, I wish that I could. I do have a couple of phrases in my repertoire that my dad, said to me, but I'd say barked at me when I was young with my siblings, and one of those that was emblazoned in my mind is Oscar and Doris Masada Holly. Dad used to scream that at me and my siblings every time we left the door open, which was often in country Victoria. He'd say Oscar and Doris and then follow that up with, were you born in a tent? When I thought I'd better fact check that so I didn't embarrass myself in front of everybody today, and then I realised Dad got his Gaelic words mixed up, and he was actually telling us to leave the door open. Yes. And so I thought, well, I like this as a tradition I'll pass on to my two young kids every time they leave the door open, which I hope's often, but I'll be telling them Dune Doris, not Oscar and Doris. And I hope that that's often. So on behalf of the community, I'd like to thank Val and Mary for publishing this important book, and I'd also like to thank the authors for contributing their expertise and time for writing it, and I hope that it sells out and a second edition is necessary. So thank you, and I might pass it on to someone who can actually speak Gaelic.
Well, the second speaker is the Gaelic speaker. I'm afraid I can't pronounce the way to say it in Gaelic. So Joan is well known as Joan Maloney. She's is a teacher at the Irish Language Association of Victoria, and she's a former Michael O'Sullivan Award winner for the Celtic Club back in 2017. So she's a prominent member of the Celtic Club as well. So please welcome Joan.
Díomh chuirde is mór an órdam a bheith ag láirtlaí bhniuh agus gan buchas do bheal as o cuire hútam chun bheith láthir an seo ag seola an leabhar seo. Gaeilge Ghriandoite A to Z. Many thanks to Val for inviting me to be part of the launch of this book, Gaeilge Ghriandoite. But he asked me to speak in Irish. So a brief summary of what I'm about to say, and this is pretty brief. This is the first all-Irish book written and published by Australians in Australia. And Irish has been spoken and written in this country in various ways and forms over the past 200 years. And Gaeilge Ghriandoite reminds us that behind every article and every story and every inscription on tombstones throughout the country, there are people with their own story to tell. And I would like to acknowledge and to congratulate the authors, Robert, Colin, Val and Greg, who's in Sydney, for their tremendous work and their research into bringing these people and their stories to life in this book. So that's all I'm saying. I'll spare. Sorry for the people who don't understand us Gaeilge, but anyway. Olor an néuístíag bhí Gaeilge ó labhairt agus á scríobh, hawl agus a bhas I nótaine éagsúla ar fud na tíre seo. Conas graim a óil ar snótha na Gaeilge a nús trí níos mó ná 200 bliain. I dtír cófarsing agus I más daoine cóforleathan. Nar go raibh ólas ag drama bháin, go raibh gastra eile ag trabhas sa bhort chéine. Bhín an job a thug Val, Colin, Greg agus Robert ortha féin. Agus tá tora a go taide ar star na Gaeilge agus ar cultúr na Gael san Austráil le fáil sa leabhar seo. Is Colin gur scríobh Val féin leabhar Ryan Blinta ó hin, Hidden Ireland in Victoria, the first ever overview of Gaelic culture and the Irish language in Victoria. An nói, bhí sé sin scríofa I Merla. Ach sílim, gur raibh an leabhar sin, an síl, ón ar ascar an leabhar nua seo, atá á seoladh a gcuim. Tá an leabhar seo go hiomlán I Gaeilge. Tá Val ar duine des na húdar, agus ina cheanta tá trúr scoláirí eile, Greg Byrnes, Robert Lindsey agus Colin Ryan. Australig iad ile. Ní úrscéil é ar nói, ach tá creaclach na teanga san Austráil le fáil. Ní cnúsach scéalta é ach airad. Ché go bhfuil ar a laid, cúpla dozéin scéal ar le, ag buint le clachtóirí na Gaeilge sa tír seo le líon an 200. Ach cuireann Gaeilge Ghriandoite I gcuine dit, go raibh daoine áirithe taobh hir de gach alta scríbú agus gach cúpla focail ar leachanna uige agus a scéalta féin I gach duine acu. Tá nótaí beaga bethasnéise ann, agus tagart ar saothar ar dóibh iad, agus tá fáil ar cúpla slí chun teacht ortha. Tá na hiontrálacha sa úsáidte ó A go Z, agus ag deireadh an leabhar, tá leabhar lista a bhfuil a fána féin ag buint leis. Gaeilge Ghriandoite an tidal an leabhar, agus cilíonn sin Sunburnt Irish language. Sé sin an teanga mar a labhraítear agus a scríbhtar é san Austráil, agus é chortha in iarúnt don timpeallacht nua, agus ba é Colin tá hís an sin chum an tal sin an Gaeilge Ghriandoite. Má éiceann tú ar chlúdach an leabhar, tá Greengraph de Forest Creek, Muskerry, hir thuig ó Bendigo. Agus éireann an áit sin don tidal mar áit atá Ghriandoite. Taobh tá Greengraph agsúla a haspónan roinn daoine a bhí agus atá dígriseach ó thaobh an teanga Gaelach san Austráil ó neo-ístíag an anús agus takes an starúla fitte fúte tríd comá. An nói, tá an Gaeilge san Austráil ó 1978 nuair a tháinig an chéad chalach I dtír I Botany Bay. Cheap an túdarrás in New South Wales gur 6 teanga rúnda a bhí ann. Níl éon eolas cruinneagainn ar an méid Gaeilgeoirí a tháinig go dtí an tír seo mar déránig agus ní bheidh go deo is tócha de cheall fianaise. I Melbourne, Jarróg an scéal go raibh roinn Gaeilgeoirí ann óna blianta tosaigh de réir Edmund Garryowen Finn an tiriseoir ó chundé an chlár a tháinig an seo go luath ins na 80 Comála sin, ben éireannach a ben chéile John Bettman, ceannaí ar an Port Phillip Association agus a bhanig Melbourne. Ailís ní chealachán a benam den dé agus ba chalín ó I as inis I gcóndé an chlár nuair a chuirú amach I go Van Diemen's Land sna 80 Michelle's cóndé an chlár freshens. Más fear gur saoil I timpeall 80 in éireann na hÉireann ní fallár ná go raibh níos mó ná cúpla focail ché. Agus I ag teacht an seo I bhád rihhaimsear an gcorta. Sa 9 díag, bhí an saoil díon ar chlucht na néireannach agus cuireadh an teanga agus an cultúr Gaelach ar le taobh. Ach sa fiú is, bhí rudaí ag éirí níos fearr, agus thosnig athbheocann an cultúr a rís leis an gceol, an dáilsa Gaeilge agus an teanga. Tá tugartaí sa leabhar seo ar roinntmhád daoine agus ar eagraíochtaí a bhí páirteach I rinne tréimhsí sin. Mar chuid an tidal, tá hAon scríofa, means number 1. Ciallaíonn sin is tócha, go bhfuil sé in aontain ag na húdar, ag ran a dó churamach sa todhchaí, agus bheadh fáilte roimhe le héad. Tá go leor eile gur féidir a bheith ann. Mar hampla, an effran as Gaeilge atá ar siúil ar feadrach a bliain sa tír seo. Pop-up Gaeltachtaí, Gaeilge ábhóna san Welfare Bureau, ar a tugadh scoil scarta nó bhí sé ar siúil, le head schools. Daoine óga á álam. Siúpaí leabhar in Melbourne a bhí ag díal leabhar as Gaeilge agus lá náisiúnta, agus go leor eile. Beidir go mbeadh éilimh ar leabhar dá theangach amach an seo. What I'm saying here is there may be a demand for a bilingual book in the future. Breathin sé. Mar a dúirt mé I dosach, tá an leabhar seo go thomláin I Gaeilge. An chéad leabhar riamh as Gaeilge, scríofa agus fáiltethe ag Austrrálaigh san Austráil. So Tres Lim na Húdar, Rís, Val, Colin, Robert agus Greg. As an éacht seo, agus na fáilteóirí, Val agus a bhean céile Mary Doyle. Mar sin, is leabhar fear anna bheith. It's a very rare book. Agus dá bhrí sin is Ara in Valha A. It's a collector's item. Bí cinnte go bhfuil an leabhar seo an shelf agat sa bhaile. Make sure you have it on your shelf sa bhaile. Gur maith agaibh.
Thank you, Joan. And I understood that a number of you understood the whole speech, which is very good that some people could, but we all understood what you were saying anyhow. Thank you. The final speaker before we have some music is Dr. Kevin Malloy, who is the Principal Librarian of the Victorian and Australian Collections at the State Library of Victoria. And Karen Fogarty and I, who's in the audience, interviewed Kevin probably 2 months ago about himself, and one of the points he did make was that he's interested in capturing or collecting, the Irish experience. So if anyone wants to talk to him afterwards about documents, photographs, etc., Kevin's quite willing to talk to you about that. Kevin, you ought to do the Australian or the Australian version of what we heard. Kevin.
Diolch, ich mich Quivine Malloy, ich honor a anseo. Greetings everyone, my name is Kevin Malloy. It's an honour to be here. I work at the State Library. I'm Principal Librarian, Victorian Australian Collections, and I want to talk about this marvellous book, the first full Irish language publication to appear in Australia. Australia has a rich linguistic history, at least 60,000 years old, something we must all acknowledge and cherish, as we do the Irish language. Irish was spoken as a language as one of the first major settler languages in Australia when colonists began to arrive at the end of the 18th century. It was so prevalent in New South Wales, it made the Reverend Samuel Marsden, a prominent clergyman and Parramatta magistrate, seethed with anger as he saw its existence as a sign of political opposition, political sedition, something running counter to the perceived Anglophone order. The Irish language in Australia, as the authors Greg Byrnes, Robert Lindsey, Val Noone and Colin Ryan note, had many breaks in continuity, but many common threads survived and are well documented in this volume. I want to briefly talk about how this work falls into the bibliographic stream that Irish has maintained, a very small but persistent presence, a textual visibility in Australia, and how Gaeilge Ghriandoite A falls into this tradition. It has been well noted that until the turn of the 20th century, complex texts and therefore complex ideas were largely carried through the medium of print in the main books or writing in the codex form. It is the physical presence of Irish textual objects that have had a long presence in Australia, and I want to speak about that, and it's a tradition to which Gaeilge Ghriandoite A is part. I like to think that it is no accident that the first manuscripts acquired by the Melbourne Public Library in 1863 was an Irish scribal manuscript written by Daithí de Barra. Just a year later, the library acquired the first Irish language dictionary and folklore Béala Gaeilge, compiled by Conor Begley and containing Hugh McCurtain's grammar elements of the Irish language. The volume was published by the famous Guerin family of printers in Paris in 1732, and the typefaces that they drew upon that came from the Loyson foundry in Paris were used for other Irish publications. And it was Guerin who turned down the opportunity to print Diderot's encyclopedia, so they were a well-known publishing house. It is notable that the copy the library acquired in 1864, most likely from the Irish author, collector and Irish speaker Edward Hayes, was formerly owned by Charles Valency, Irish manuscript collector and one of the founders of the Royal Irish Academy. Valency learned his Irish from the most prolific 18th century scribal scholar and collector, Maurice O'Gorman, whose works in Irish span the 18th century. O'Gorman, in his catalogue of Irish manuscripts and books, some purchased from the O'Nocton Scribal Group, noted that he had 2 copies of the Begley-McCurtain dictionary, one to sell, he also noted. And it is interesting to think that this well-thumbed volume that the library holds might possibly have been O'Gorman's and used during those language classes. Through the 1870s, the library acquired other key Irish texts, in fact many texts, and through the O'Shaughnessy collection in the 1880s, further scribal works in such important publications as Roderick O'Flaherty's Gaeilge, A History of Ireland, published in Latin in London in 1685. O'Flaherty was one of the last of the Irish earls whose estates were still intact at the time, an historian and major Irish manuscript collector, as historian Bernadette Cunningham has noted. His work was published in Latin because he had no access to Irish typefaces, such as those based on the writing of Begley in the Loyson Foundry. It should also perhaps be not forgotten that McCurtain was an acquaintance of Jonathan Swift and part of the Sean and Ty O'Nocton scribal circle in Dublin, that circle that ensured the survival of so many Irish manuscripts. McCurtain was the only Irish language writer in the 18th century to have a piece of literary writing published in Irish, and that appears as a poem at the start of the English-Irish dictionary. And that poem is significant to today's publication of Gaeilge Ghriandoite A, and that it celebrated the need for Irish language and culture to survive and to be made accessible through bibliographic and lexical tools. In the late 1870s, the Melbourne Public Library began to acquire the complete set of the British Ordnance Survey photo zincographs of the Irish 16th and 17th century manuscripts, produced from 1874 and called the Facsimiles of the National Manuscripts of Ireland. These were edited by John Gilbert, husband of Rosa Mulholland, who wrote extensively for the Melbourne Advocate in the 19th century. These colour reproductions of Irish language texts were used heavily by O'Donnell in his Irish language work, and he makes a number of references to visiting the library, using these works and noting how important they were. These are remarkable state-of-the-art colour copies of Irish language manuscripts with detailed maps and extensive correspondence from individuals like Hugh O'Neill, Hugh O'Donnell and other Irish language political figures. And so it goes on as other collections came to the library, including one by the Irish government in the early 1950s with the first copy of Martin O'Kine's Creanachilly, read by someone in our lending library in the 1980s, and Walter Osborne's important Irish collection that he gave to the library in the early 1960s. My point is that these collections contained key texts in the Irish language tradition, some incredibly rare, and they were present in Australia almost from the start of colonial settlement. Some were carried by known people, many unknown, but with works like Hugh McCurtain, for example, being found in the Melbourne Parliamentary Library, the Alexander Turnbull Library in New Zealand, the Mechanics Institute in Penola in South Australia, and in the Melbourne Public Library. These texts were used and consulted by Irish language scholars and writers like Edward Hayes, who acquired and owned many of them, the itinerant Irish miner John O'Regan, working in Greymouth and visiting Melbourne in 1879, who noted his visit to the Melbourne Public Library to use the McCurtain O'Begley Dictionary because his own personal copy had been lost in a fire. Nicholas O'Donnell, who used the National Manuscript reproductions and most likely other Irish texts. And of course Thomas Culhane, who consulted everything Irish in the library, and even heavily annotating one of the scribal manuscripts. And then we have our present scholars, Greg Byrnes, Colin Ryan, Robert Lindsey and Val Noone, who have all consulted and written about Irish language books and texts in the collection. Finally, why are Irish language dictionaries and biographical dictionaries like Gaeilge Ghriandoite A so important? The O'Nocton Circle in 18th century Dublin answered that question. The codification of language and lexical and biographical information occurs at important cultural and political junctures, when there is a need to systematise, to record, to codify for the future, capturing that which might be lost, the meaning, complexity, the vibrancy of the language and culture, and making it explicable for use in the present and as a guide to future generations. Gaeilge Ghriandoite is a book that brings together all we know to date about how the Irish language found expression in Australia and how the language was promoted and used and by whom. It makes that which was previously hidden public, and as a publication it makes us aware that there are so many other questions to be asked. I'm drawing a very long bow here, but one I think that is warranted. Books talk to each other over the generations and the centuries, through those who have had ownership of them, have used them, and the context in which they have been used and passed on. That is what bibliographic scholarship is all about. This publication, Gaeilge Ghriandoite, will join the works of McCurtain, O'Begley, O'Flaherty, Doherty Barra, and many others, as it is now part of that Irish language tradition. It will consolidate the place the Irish language has in Australia, help generate more interest in the language, and lead to more elements of the Irish language being discovered. This is a pioneering work, the first Irish language text produced by Irish Australia. It is an important Australian Irish language biographical and bibliographical tool, and is a credit to the scholarship of Greg Byrnes, Robert Lindsey, Noone and Colin Ryan. We are in their debt for this work and the publication. On Rud, Ishaniv, Ishetak, the thing that's seldom seen is wonderful. Gurumachid.
Thank you, Kevin. You now know how important the State Library of Victoria is now after that speech, and we're very pleased that Kevin's there. Eamon, we're going to have a short musical session. Do you want to announce what you're going to do?
Yes, we've got a few songs in Irish. The first couple you might like to join in if you know the words. Val will introduce the next two, and we'll see how we go from there.
You want to do Gaeilge first?
Magillamar first. Okay, Magillamar first, and then Borgine Islami.
Yeah.
And help drown out my pronunciation. Anyway, here we go.
Colin Jazz Putin of all.
Okay.
We're going to do body nine next.
Who's in charge, Cal?
Oh no, well he thought it was what he thought it was. Stand up for that. Okay. Body nine, come on, you all know that one. Oh, for love of God.
Body nine, Jimmy, come on, body nine, is filing me on. Body nine, Jimmy, come on, body nine, is filing me on. Body vida, body biosa, body vida, body nine, body dira, body jota, body nine, is filing me on. Body nine, Tori, body nine, is filing me on. Body nine, Tori, body nine, is filing me on. Body nina, body biosa, body biosa, body nine, body dira, body jota, body nine, is filing me on.
Gaeilge Ghriandoite intro when Colin just couldn't mount. Page 51 of our book, there's an entry on Jack Jones, a 13-year-old son of Owen Jones and Anne Kennedy, Anne from Tipperary. During the party at his mother's hotel in Glenrowan on Sunday night, the 27th of June 1880, Ned Kelly asked Anne to sing. She declined. Instead, she called her son Jack, who sang The Wild Colonial Boy, and Colleen Jas Cruton the Moe, the pretty maid milking the cow. Hours later, when the police attacked the hotel, they shot Jack and he died in the Wangaratta hospital soon after. Here is the second of the songs that Jack sang that night.
Okay, so this is Colin Jazz Putin of Mo. It's a slow air, and yeah, and in English, it's the
Pretty girl milking the cow.
pretty girl milking the cow. Okay, yeah.
page 19 has the Connerys. The Connerys were three brothers, Porrig, Seamus and Sean from Waterford, who they opposed the landlords, but they got transported to New South Wales in the 1830s. Just the mention was made of the breaks in the tradition when this song was sort of rediscovered about 100 years ago. People thought it was a 1798 song, but it's actually an 1830 song. Anyway, it's a rare and very beautiful Shannon song of the old style, and the refrain, the very pathetic refrain, is that the people who wrote the song wrote it in Ireland, and they pray that the Connerys would come back from New South Wales, which they never did.
Quivin Malacha, Quim Shajakar, those grand victory. Aaron Casrood, a thaw Kangalcha, God Lule the Hiv, Marcy to Tarafi, Hilo her Kushlafi, her not through her far shiv, is Kerna Connery. Harna Foragay, Gurgin and New South Wales. On Che Havekna Chesavon, a gently Mucknefer, or Gusha Play. Mother Shessie Shid, on Shokter Mudgeon, Gurgi Tareshane. Crayon Tolifuin, Lelena Lower a torch the break is McGraw Cannonball, Tashe Damanta, most very unclear. A Van Reen Vanaha is a rain of fluish gill, Tor Fulsh Gussaren. Is Erna Banaltra, a Thosa Walya, God do Vok in her Lelen on her friend, Biggie a Gogleviv, is a Gwee Hunjay. Erna Connery, a Horcha William going, Osman New South Wales.
Beautiful.
Well, on your behalf, may I thank all the musicians, Grace, Carmel, Chris, David and Eamon Spillane, who organised it. Please thank them all. Can I get the two authors to come up who are going to do the next part of the program? Chris and Robert.
Have you panned the whole room?
So Chris is the first of the speakers.
Colin.
Colin, sorry, yes, Colin. He studied Russian at Melbourne University first, then taught himself the Irish language. He was the SBS Irish program presenter when it was a program, and he publishes a fortnightly newsletter in Irish. Colin, please.
All right, I'll start in Irish. I won't go on for too long. You won't be too bored. Come here.
Colin,
It's more than over there. Lord, in size of Corey Dowley Kayla. Agus, ach bíon sér mill is fiarchuige. Daar ben nog in nu die zoog. Niet goed nog indien er liggen. Ach, daar laan tijde dento hinalo. Agus, ik wat niet small olishagun. Ir ster na tangencha. Is mahnash lausha dan stari. Ach, is biag stari astralach a dolum Gaeilge. Beter gedjoch gachru ir scales in vaste. Ach, as midde is maul. Is dolum nach feder alle somlaan al ir na herende. When an Australia mach sa nieuw histeer. Mora wil leef na Gaeilge agad. Agus alles agad daar ir een doeges. Hoe zie je het ook? Daar alles in zo. Ir een shen. Is ir een Noone. Ir een melf. Agus na bio. En te alleen een lauwer. Bezig mech interesseerd. nirchin dina bhí páirteach I saoil na Gaeilge san Austrráil nó eile. Agus is dócha go bhfuil ólas le beidú fós. This is a very interesting book because, as has been said already, it's the first book to be published entirely in Irish in Australia. Now, that said, Dimf Nalonigan, an Irish speaker over in Adelaide, has published a bilingual book of her own short stories in Irish and English quite recently. This is rather different, of course. It's avowedly a work of scholarship, and perhaps a rather odd one for someone like me to be involved with, because I'm not nearly the scholar that the other participants are, and I'm primarily a writer of fiction and poetry, and that's the sort of stuff I publish. But I really appreciate the scholarly gifts of the others. And as I said in Irish, it was a job and a half, but well worth the trouble. If you compare the situation here in Australia and, for example, in the United States, it's very interesting. The United States received many more Irish speakers in the course of the night. It was quite high. And we know from the research that's been carried out quite recently, especially by Val, that the majority of them spoke Irish as the first language, and they kept on speaking it here. And we know of at least a few instances where they passed it on to their children. Of course, after that, the language is lost because it's an immigrant society. Languages fade away and are replaced by the majority language. But that's not to say, of course, that all cultural traces of the immigrants die. And things to say of the Greeks or Italians and so on. There are some excellent Irish speakers working in the United States, but I would say that the scholarship carried out here, especially in Melbourne, but not forgetting Greg in Sydney, is equal in quality to anything you would find over there, even though there are so few of us, and even though the Irish-speaking community here is relatively small. And this book is, I think, something we can all be proud of. I don't know whether it'll come to a second edition, I hope so. There'll always be new stuff to put in, and of course, corrections. And if anyone here has anything they think might be of interest to us, please get in touch. Now, I do hope myself that we do other stuff like this, but it is a lot of work, as I've said, and none of us are getting any younger except for this work. But it was certainly a privilege to work with them, and we got on remarkably well. It will also, I hope, spur something similar to be done. Do excuse me. That'll be my wife getting anxious. Spurs other work of the same sort in America, in Britain perhaps, and in Canada, because all of those were countries to which large numbers of Irish-speaking migrants went. And with that, I think I shall stop.
Hurry home.
Thank you, Colin. The other author that we've got today is Robert Lindsey. He teaches at Penola College in Byrnes, and he gained a PhD from Melbourne University in 2015, and I'll give you the topic, a thesis on the impact of the Welsh language movement on 20th century Irish language reforms. And in that study, he uncovered a surprising amount of interaction between the Irish and Welsh groups. Robert, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much. All right, Gramagiv. I'm sorry in advance if I slip between English, Irish. If you hear a couple of words in Spanish, don't be that surprised. It's quite possible after all these years. In any case, Gaeilge Ghriandoite A agus gurb míle maithagat teachtain seo ar an lá fúr báise seo. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming down to this launch on this very cold, rainy afternoon. Is an ódúin a bheith I láthrinniuh, chuann sé an ódúin an spéis atá ag an diasporas an Austráil I dionscnamh mar seo. Tásúil am go tugann an obair seo léir agus daobh star le Noonach na Gaeilge sa tír seo, agus beidir inspiráid amach an seo, do rií chun úsáid a bhaid as an teangas a chaint, ceol agus cultúr na tíre Ghriandoite seo. Mar Austrálach le íireacht beag as éireann, fear dólann sé an teanga go ceandána mar aróg, táim brodúil a bheith páirteach le seo. Na dúil go sí má fós le amseartha, broiteach agus bás I measc mo chláán le déanamh, bíad siúd constantí móra de hir, agus tás go maith Val, Colin agus Greg, Gwyl sais imposter syndrome agam Marial sin. Wait for the English translation. Arenos, win me ansult as an obair seo. Excríomh píosís the ruler topicí ag súla. Mór raibh páirteagam cosú leis an trúr scribnóirí eile. Is féidir go mbeadh daoine agus topicí tábhachtacha garín trál san obair seo. Tám anbhuioch de Colin agus Greg as St. Ollas, agus Fionn bheith có Ibrú le chéile, agus do Val an rud céine, ach an díon obair a bhíige chun I a dhearra agus currigló chomá. Tá sé mar mentó dom, chomá le cara I gcónaí, agus tám brodúil a bheith páirteach I sihir mar seo leis. So very basically, I've said so far, your presence today very much shows the kind of enthusiasm a project like this can create amongst the diaspora here in Australia. I hope that this work reminds readers of the continuity of the Irish language and of some people that history almost forgot about entirely. And as an Aussie who stubbornly chose to learn the language from scratch as a young adult, I'm proud to have been part of the project. I've basically thanked my colleagues for their expertise and teamwork, and to Val for his publishing and organisational skills. Always been as much a mentor as a friend, and I'm proud to share the limelight on this occasion. Fuiera, Tom Harvey Buach de Macharja Erenig agus Iad gan brain folla a wan de Shinchiracht as Aaron, the high and spatial vehicles at Chelmsford Renew Contienta Show. Where am I? There we go. Go more my fiance agus Spervan Sarah, Jathan and Ferrinia, Hanig ar Sula de Hale de Hedor, Ravlian Hin Inuv. So for those who didn't understand, I was just basically thanking my friends, Irish and non-Irish, also to my fiance Sarah, and it just so happens that we met 2 years ago on this very day. So I just wanted to at the end of it. So, ig gan nomad, be cúpla focalagam song carad agus ho-úder atá as láthar iniu Greg Byrnes. An tain scribná atá ina chóní lasmuig de Victoria, tá sé 6 cean ródaí I léon Gaelachas an Austráil, agus tá creidúint breise tiltte aige as a St. Ollas, chomá leis an líofacht a Eisreachán féin. So I'm just going to say now a couple of words passed on from our absent friend and co-author Greg Byrnes of Sydney. Our one contributor from outside Victoria, I've basically said he's pioneered a lot of Irish language research in Australia, and he has to be given credit for the path that he started to pave in previous decades. So here's his Teachtarach. Gawm Paradúnagih as gan be Láthar, buchas ó chrí do Val, Colin agus Rob, agus an leabhar Gaeilge Ghriandoite A Thiola, Jerem Leahy, mo bheannach leat as Graveen, leis an ggóúidir d'éiream, Cheannaigh, Léigi, Dólaigh. So he says, apologies for my absence. Heartfelt thanks to Val, Colin and Rob. As the book Gaeilge Ghriandoite is launched, I send a blessing with it. What he actually technically said there was, my blessings to you, little book. Something along those lines. And to those present, I say the following. Buy it, read it, share it. Good of Mila Mahalis.
Thank you, Robert. Well, I gather all of you here know Val Noone. I mean, it's very hard to, I think everyone here's heard of him or met him or read his works. And as you know, he's a prolific author. And I'm afraid, and it's unfortunate that your major work, Hidden Island, Victoria, is out of print. I mean, that in my view is very, very disappointing. So, The other thing I perhaps should say about Val, he's a life member of the Celtic Club, and that's the reason why the Celtic Club is co-hosting this today. Val, it's yours.
The Buekas the Celtic Club, agus Siobhan Levin, as Gahoraha, the Peter Gavin, agus the Hosh the Dukas. Buekas Chama, the hAon, agus Kevin, Eamon, agus Nicole Chory, Essen Shola Show, but as Shiv Fain, Galer, as Ver Takiot. Thanks to Siobhan Levin and the Celtic Club, especially to Peter Gavin, without whom this event would not have taken place. Thanks Siobhan and Kevin, and Eamon and the musicians, and to all of you for your support. Is an all more doing Domsa agus Domo Van Kayla Mary a bay in a Volshi Ori, the Gaeilge Ghriandoite A. Tomid Brodul as a Go Ibru, the Colin, Greg and Robert, Sunlau and Starul Sean. Tabu and the Dangaka a Colin agus Greg agus Rob is Misha and Keheru Fa Hangoli. Ac before and pleasure dom a ve im mo egaho mo clochurador a gak focal da will on. Inu bawalon bay a kind free Kira Rud, Efad Tumblegar. My wife and Mary are very honoured to work with Colin, Greg and Rob in publishing this historic book. And of the team, I'm really number 4 in language, but I'm proud that I have typeset every word of the book. I want to make just 4 short comments. Scale Rahain scale per Santa and for a meme ag folum gwerga. Sna nokadi vi me immo uktoron ag hola Collingwood College agus a iritas da dishmahori osima a chla mother tongue maintenance is a shin koharu mohahanga do prep go to grad 3 out highly Vietnami Shini agus Turkey. Furshid mat nis arja son mansko no dalti ella. Agan am kaina vi chonka autumn amor hadrif les an vila Louis de Puer bin an treifsha maradut and shanokkel alia lias tu fain. Agus me kega she blian dish hossi meg fallen gwega ma irak aster culture agawol agus esonna bi exulachta Tangoliki. But how did I come to study Irish? That's what that is. In the 90s, I was chairman of school council down at Collingwood College when we introduced a mother tongue maintenance program, prep to grade 3, Vietnamese, Chinese and Turkish. Those students got better marks at secondary than the other students. At the same time, I was influenced by my friendship with the poet Louis de Puer, who was living in Melbourne at the time. And I decided the proverb, physician, heal thyself, needed to be applied. At the age of 56, I set about reclaiming some lost family history, but I also saw the thing as part of promoting linguistic biodiversity. We need biodiversity in nature, we need it in languages as well. And I must say that every word you get, I think, is a pleasure and a milestone. Words are enough. Came for Laura Gaeilge go himlawn a false shoe. Came for. So in Austral is Changa Vienly e and Gaeilge. Nulan ak Beja Mila Tricade Kanchuri Dukas Beja. Beja Fiha Mila Galgori Ella era lied na Himriki. Agus Kui Cade Astralak Nushe Shin Kincha. Agus he must Astralak ta his ag kark go will jacka a Gaeilge Olam. And shin ta plan for treifshak a gvur gaher udo. But while in bunsra lodger is on the ganchori agus na volumori akushis, why not a bilingual book? There may be such, okay, but Irish is a minority language. There are possibly about 1,300 native speakers in the country. If you follow the Irish census figures, amongst the 72,000 Irish immigrants in the country, there's probably 20,000 at least who can speak some Irish. Amongst the Australians, amongst ourselves, we think maybe we know about 500 Australians who can speak Irish. Well, we decided that in this situation we should take a long-term view and put down a solid foundation for the other speakers. I don't know whether we merit being put by DeBara and McCruton, but we'll take that on board. I think that's pretty nice. Iver tree, the Drochionka coronavirus. Nura vula malakela is Gaeilge Ghriandoite Colin, Greg as Robert McHane. Hokrima Aaron Lausho Ayenov. Eganamshin Grayson Lodger in the groupie Gaeilge in Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, agus Canberra. Scolin Sauri, Scolin Givri, agus Ryan Kirko Cora Homa. Akanish Toshk COVID and Needeg, agus Lawa Falsha, Tana Grayson Brista. Shocky Ovjacon Biogi Gravios a Ficadol, Becher, agus go Punta Oraha, Tasulagam, go Guidoi ala Leshin. When we started the book 3 years ago, the Irish language networks in the southeast of Australia were in a pretty healthy condition with winter schools, summer schools and so on. But COVID-19 has shattered those. They survived, but they are shattered. So a small revival is taking place this year, and I just hope that our book can make a small contribution in that regard. And book Punta and Lau, just some highlights from the 195 entries. Laura Eras, okay. Imaskna Kad Noka Kui. Mahompla. Amshu I Sydney a Greg Byrnes, da Hampla Lua den Gaeilge Skrifa, Seshin na love Scrovini a Hug and Taha Daniel Power less. Shaplina den a Dorani of a Power, a Honig go Sydney, Octeg Fitter J. You'll find here you'll report on Greg Byrnes' amazing discovery of handwritten Irish notes in Sydney in the 1820s by Father Daniel Power, who was a convict chaplain, who actually reproduced a picture of the page. Agus a Kimri den Tree Lawer Leshan Buku on Bungari, Car Will. Imaha? Colin, Buku on Bungari. There are summaries of 3 books of Colin's in here, short stories and poetry. Colin is published in Irish, in Ireland, and it's great to have that. She Robert Lindsey den Lauer, den Ober Gaelach Literaha agus Leonta le Vincent Hearns, Ruga Tuga Vincent in Clifton Hill, Caid Blino Hin. You'll also find Robert Lindsay's report on Vincent Hearns, born and bred in Clifton Hill 100 years ago, a terrific output in literature and art that's been completely lost and is now recovered. Truca do introl Einar Fli Vno Part Quidju son Covinanish Inskana. We've made a little contribution to gender balance. We've got 32 entries exclusively on women in this publication. And there's also Lagan Gaeilge den Righteous Uluru on Cree, Astrahela Tomas de Waldher. We've published a translation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart by Thomas de Waldher in Sydney. So they're just 4 little highlights I might mention from several others. Lawa haba ata on agus nil ak $50 uri. Fos is maradut shun era in valaha a e. Shiname scale. The Gaeilge Ghriandoite costs only $20. It's a collector's item. Don't miss out getting one for yourself and one for your friends. God of Milligan. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Val, and thank you all the speakers. I've got a little quote that might sum up this book and the launch. and it's not from an Irish person, I'm afraid. It's from Van Gogh or Van Gogh, how you want to pronounce it. But there's an exhibition or a digital exhibition of his in the Loom. But his quote is, "Great things are done by a series of small things brought together." I think that sums up your book and the launch very well. So Joel's going to stay here and he'll sell books and he'll sign any books that anyone wants to sign. Thank you for attending.
And the musicians and the bar
Can
will
we
be
keep
open.
playing? Yes.
With a final song.
Oh, right.
I've got to, sorry, come on, let's go.
We're up to that.
Announce it.
Okay, oh, Rosh the Bahawanya.
Okay.
Okay, don't join in that one.
A farewell song, okay.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Can we stand up?
No, go on,
Okay,
stand.
no, stand up. Okay, Joe.
You won't be wanting any of these,
I don't think so. Well, but I think I will because I'm getting enough postal orders. Give me 10.
Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Mr. Hopton County. Shade of a haven van lover to a break to beg in name. We the grey saver Merlin. It's the international Gaelic. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. And Mr. Hopton County. Bronya Melek Chopter Zoya Oga Gorman Lamar Northern Grady Face from my stomach. It's pretty Bruner darling. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Oh, Rosh the Bahawanya. Mr. Hopton County. Shade of the Havan, the lover, though we're great